Today's video is going to be a little bit different than usual. Our video editor, David, had to make an unexpected trip out of the country to see family this week. Don't worry, everything's fine, but it does mean we were working with much tighter timelines for our production schedule than normal. Because we didn't want to leave you all with nothing, though, we decided to still put a little something together. Today, we're going to be covering 5 true crime stories on a single theme. Specifically, we're going to be looking back at some of our favorite cases that were solved using weird or unconventional bits of evidence. Just a heads up, while these stories are from previous videos, they've all been completely re-edited, and we've never done any of them on camera before. As always, my name is Nigel, I run this channel with my good friend Luke, and welcome back to Crime Zone. A reminder, if you do find today's video interesting and informative, be sure to like and subscribe for more true crime stories told with a mysterious and suspenseful vibe. With that out of the way, let's dive in. At around 6 a.m. on August 11th, 2000, 22-year-old Tracy Tomko left her home in Akron, Ohio, and set out for her morning jog. She'd always been an avid runner, inspired by her father, who ran marathons, and with whom she had participated in small events and local races with growing up. Recently, Tracy had decided she really wanted to run a marathon of her own, and had selected the Towpath, an annual event held in Cleveland along the Towpath Trail, which was originally established to promote the Ohio and Erie Canalway. With the marathon coming up that fall, Tracy had been training hard. As she set out that morning, Tracy headed out of her sprawling neighborhood complex known as the Timbertop Apartments and Townhomes. The complex is located in a more sparsely developed, forested area on the northern outskirts of Akron, the kind of place that seemed to offer perfect scenery and a tranquil environment for runners like Tracy. However, it was here, along a quiet, tree-lined access road called Canyon Brook Drive, that she would abruptly disappear. The first sign that something was wrong came at around 7:45 a.m. that morning, when Tracy's colleagues at the retirement planning company where she worked as a financial analyst started to arrive and noticed that she wasn't there. Having a reputation for being both punctual and extremely organized, this immediately stuck out to Tracy's coworkers as odd. As one colleague later put it, quote, "You could set your clock by her." When more than 15 minutes had passed and Tracy was officially late, people started to grow seriously concerned. At some point, Tracy's family members were contacted, and by that afternoon, her parents had filed a missing persons report. Before a real search effort could even get off the ground, though, police received a call at about 3:30 that afternoon concerning a chilling discovery made by a group of kids who were playing in the woods near the Timbertop complex. They said that they had found a woman's body. When police went out to the scene, everyone's worst fears were soon confirmed. They had discovered the body of Tracy Tomko. She was in the forest a couple hundred feet off of Canyon Brook Drive, the access road that was part of her running route. Based on Tracy's injuries, it was quickly determined that she had likely been the victim of a hit and run. More specifically, it appeared that she had been hit from behind while jogging by a vehicle that was traveling in the same direction, after which she had been dragged into the forest, presumably by the culprit, who had tried to cover up what had happened. Back on the road adjacent to where Tracy had been discovered, police found small clues that had been left behind from the collision. Glass believed to be from a car's windshield was scattered in the area, as was a small quarter-sized piece of plastic believed to have come from the same vehicle. While this seemed to confirm investigators' theory about a hit and run, unfortunately, this was the extent of the evidence they were able to find. Hoping for further leads, they turned to the public, asking for anyone who might have seen anything to come forward. In particular, they told people to look out for any vehicles with signs of suspicious damage, especially ones that had cracked or broken windshields. Within just a couple of days, police announced that they had received a promising lead from a male witness who said that he had seen a car parked along the side of the road at the approximate time and place of the hit and run. The man described the vehicle he had seen as an older model, boxy-shaped car with damage to its front end and windshield. He said that the car was either blue or teal and might have been a Chevy Cavalier. No sooner had this new information been announced than police made a second update about the case. A vehicle matching the witness's description had just been found in Summit Lake, about a 20-minute drive south of the crime scene. When the car was pulled out of the lake, things looked extremely promising. Not only was the vehicle a teal Chevy Cavalier, but it also had damage to its windshield and front end. Unbelievably, however, the vehicle turned out to be a massive coincidence. It turned out that it had been stolen from a family the morning after Tracy's death on a road extremely close to the south end of Summit Lake. When police showed a picture of the vehicle to the witness that had originally come forward, he also said that he didn't think it was a match. With that, this promising lead was ruled out. More appeals to the public for information followed, but this time weeks began to pass with no substantial breaks made in the investigation. Understandably, the lack of resolution to the case was disturbing to many of the locals in the area, particularly those who lived in the Timbertop apartment complex. Though Tracy had only moved into the neighborhood a few months prior, she had made an impact on several of her neighbors in that time who knew her as a friendly and kind person. This was especially true of a married couple named Linda and Douglas French, who said that they waved to Tracy almost every day as they drove past her while they were on their way to work and she was out for her morning run. The thought that someone could have hit her accidentally was one thing, but the idea that this person could have then dragged Tracy off the road without trying to get her help was haunting. What was most chilling of all, however, was the fact that the crime had happened on the Canyon Brook Access Road, a route seldom used by anyone who didn't live in the area. The Frenches therefore concluded that the person responsible for the terrible crime was likely living in their midst. As more time began to pass, Tracy's family desperately tried to keep her story in the news, hoping that their persistence would reach the right potential witness, or maybe even weigh on the culprit enough that they would come forward of their own volition. When the Towpath Marathon came around that October, at least 25 members of Tracy's family participated, including her parents, who carried the #1 bib from the marathon, which had been given to them in honor of Tracy's memory. Just over a month later, police issued a surprise update in the case. They had found the driver responsible for Tracy's hit-and-run killing, and he was now in police custody. He was a 38-year-old man named Ralph Blackwood, and he was indeed a resident of the Timbertop community. It turned out that police had been looking for the wrong make and model of car for the last few months, while the witness who had reached out to them had been mostly right on the details, and that the vehicle was teal and was a boxy-shaped older model. Ralph Blackwood's car was a 1994 Ford Tempo instead of a Chevy Cavalier. What was far more interesting, however, was how detectives had arrived at this discovery. The entire case had hinged on that quarter-sized piece of plastic that had been found on the road at the crime scene. With just this small piece of evidence, authorities had eventually been able to determine that the fragment had come from a teal Ford Tempo, with further analysis narrowing the make down to a 3-year period. With this information in hand, Akron police had briefed as many of their officers as possible about the discovery, asking them to be on the lookout for any potential matches. Just days later, an officer on the 3 to 11 p.m. shift was in a parking lot in the Timbertop apartment complex when he noticed a teal Ford Tempo. Upon closer inspection, the officer realized that vehicle had a small hole in its front grille area, close to the left headlight. It turned out to be an exact match to the quarter-sized plastic fragment police had recovered from the hit-and-run crime scene. Additional investigation would show that the owner of the vehicle, Ralph Blackwood, had replaced the windshield shortly after the hit and run. He had hidden the car in his garage in the immediate aftermath of the crime before taking it out of state to get the windshield fixed. When police questioned Ralph, he eventually confessed to hitting Tracy, saying that he had panicked after the collision and, assuming she was dead, had dragged her into the wooded area where she had been found. Though the hit and run was now solved, there was still one truly horrifying detail to come. When investigators finally released the results of Tracy's autopsy, the medical examiner ruled that while the blunt force injuries and fractures she had sustained from being hit by Ralph's car had been a significant contributing factor to her death, it was not the direct cause. Instead, her death was caused by being dragged to the forested area where Ralph had left her, which just so happened to be filled with mud and puddles of water. Unconscious and injured from the collision, Tracy had drowned. Despite these stunning revelations, authorities opted not to increase the charges against Ralph Blackwood, and instead, in January of 2001, he pleaded guilty to involuntary manslaughter and tampering with evidence. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison. At his sentencing hearing, Ralph offered an apology to Tracy's family, saying, quote, "I will never be able to explain why I acted the way I did. I'm not sure myself and may never be. If I didn't panic, your daughter might be here today." For their part, the Tomko family rejected this apology, with Tracy's mother leaving the courtroom during Ralph's words, and Tracy's sister saying in a tear-filled statement that 10 years was nowhere near enough time for what he had done. The judge in the case, Jane Bond, similarly condemned Ralph, saying, quote, "All that was required of you was an act of human dignity." However, she was also careful to point out that justice might never have been served in the case at all had it not been for the impressive work of Akron police. When we looked up Ralph Blackwood, we were unable to find any information about him in the state's inmate records. Perhaps this is not surprising, though, since given his sentence, he was likely released from prison more than a decade ago. Before the winter of 2015, Richard and Connie DeBate seemed to have everything going for them in life. The married couple both had good jobs, with Richard working as a computer network administrator and Connie working as a pharmaceutical sales rep, and they lived in a spacious colonial-style home in an affluent part of Ellington, Connecticut, a town located about 20 miles northeast of Hartford. They had a wide circle of friends, were well-liked by their neighbors, and were the proud parents of 2 young boys. However, the family's idyllic image would be forever shattered just a couple of days before Christmas that year, when those that knew them learned that they were the victims of an unthinkable crime. It began at around 10:15 a.m. on the morning of December 23rd, when officers from the Connecticut State Police received a call from a company called Live Watch Security. It reported that a panic alarm had been set off at one of their customers' homes on Birchview Drive. Minutes later, police received a second call, this time a 911 call directly from the homeowner of the same residence. He said that his name was Richard DeBate and that he desperately needed help. When the first emergency responders arrived at the scene, they found Richard lying on the floor of a kitchen area. He had been partially zip-tied to a chair and appeared to be suffering from some unknown injuries. When asked by the emergency workers if he could hear them, Richard terrifyingly responded, "They're still in the house." Police soon arrived in full force, and the house was searched for intruders. Though no suspects were found, it wasn't long before the search led to a tragic discovery. Richard's wife, Connie, was dead in the basement. She had been shot in the stomach and the head. Luckily, Richard wasn't too badly injured, and he was able to be questioned by investigators as paramedics rendered first aid for cuts that he had sustained to his chest and legs. He proceeded to tell a harrowing story about what had happened before police had arrived. According to Richard, the morning had started off normally enough. He and Connie had woken up early and had gotten the kids ready for school. He said that he had dropped off the boys at their bus stop sometime after 8 a.m., then returned home around 8:30 to put on a work shirt. As he got back, he saw Connie backing out of the driveway in her vehicle. She was headed to a fitness class at the local YMCA. Richard said that he had left the house once again after changing, only to realize part of the way into his commute that he had forgotten his laptop back at home. He turned around and got back to the residence sometime just before 9 a.m. At roughly the same time, though, he claimed that he received an alert that the silent alarm at the house had been tripped by something or someone. He then sent an email to his supervisor at work saying that he needed to check on something that was going on at his home. Richard said that at some point after venturing back into the house, he was grabbed and attacked by an unknown man who was dressed in camouflage and wearing a mask and gloves. He said that this man had a deep voice, which he compared to actor Vin Diesel. After a struggle, he said that he was zip-tied to the chair where he had been found, and that the masked attacker had sliced him with a box cutter numerous times while demanding information about his and his wife's credit cards and PIN numbers. Richard claimed that he had been trapped by the intruder for just a couple of minutes when Connie had unexpectedly returned home early in the middle of the assault. He yelled at her to run down into the basement to grab one of his guns, which she did. The attacker chased after Connie, and Richard said he lost sight of them. In the ensuing panic, Richard claimed that he had partially managed to free himself from the zip ties, after which he hobbled his way to the basement door. With his limited movement, though, he slipped and fell down the stairs and into the basement. It was then that he heard at least one gunshot, possibly two, after which he said he didn't hear any more sounds from Connie. The intruder then turned his attention back to Richard, and a second struggle ensued, this time with the man attacking him with a blowtorch. Richard said he had managed to wrestle it away from the suspect and burn him, after which the man fled the house. Richard said that eventually he was able to make the arduous climb back upstairs, where he hit the panic alarm on his home security system and then called 911. Despite Richard's detailed description of what had happened, there was little in the way of hard evidence that investigators had to go on. Because of the mask and camouflage gear he said the suspect was wearing, it was difficult for him to offer any specifics about the attacker's appearance. And though police set up a perimeter and expanded their search, nothing was found. Several police canines were brought in to assist with the search, but they lost any sort of scent almost immediately after leaving the house. Neighbors likewise said that they had not seen anyone suspicious in the lead up to the crime. For 16 months, it seemed that little progress was made in the case. That was until April 14th, 2017, when police announced that they had made an arrest. Their suspect was none other than Richard DeBate, and he was now being charged with his wife's murder, as well as evidence tampering and giving false statements to police. Though the news of Richard's arrest was initially a shock to those that knew him and his family, things began to make more sense when police revealed the alleged motive behind the crime. It turned out that in the months leading up to Connie's murder, Richard had reconnected with an old grade school acquaintance named Sarah Ganser. The two had started having an affair, only to realize a short time into their relationship that Sarah was pregnant. According to investigators, in the months that followed, Richard had tried to play both sides of his relationships, continuing on at home like nothing was wrong, while insisting to Sarah that it was only a matter of time before he got divorced from Connie. Detectives were able to establish this based on text messages Richard had sent throughout this time. These same text messages revealed that shortly before Connie's murder, she and Richard had gone away for a romantic weekend together in Vermont. When Connie posted photos of the trip to social media and Sarah discovered them, it caused a serious blow-up between her and Richard. Investigators alleged that with the baby on the way and with renewed pressure on him from Sarah to get a divorce, Richard realized that he was backed into a corner. Not wanting to risk his reputation or deal with the fallout from the divorce, he had instead decided to get rid of Connie permanently. When police confronted Richard about his affair, he offered bizarre and cagey explanations, sometimes acting like Connie knew about the situation, and at other times acting like she didn't. At one point, he apparently went as far as to suggest that Connie not only knew about his relationship with Sarah, she also knew about the pregnancy, and that the three of them had made plans to co-parent the baby. This was far from the only thing that Richard told police that didn't add up, though. From the very beginning, investigators had been suspicious about the story Richard told them about the morning of the murder. For starters, despite being an alleged home invasion, police had found no signs of forced entry at the DeBate residence, nor had they found anything to indicate that an intruder had been there or fled the scene. In fact, when the canine unit had been brought in to try and track the scent trail of the suspect, at least one of the dogs had reportedly made its way over to Richard, showing significant interest in him after being given things to sniff at the crime scene. The fact that Richard had only suffered superficial injuries despite the violent struggle he described having with the suspect was also seen as suspicious, as was the fact that the attacker had apparently broken in only to not steal anything from the house. In addition to this, the details of Richard's story apparently changed numerous times. At first, he told police he had only returned home after receiving the notification about the alarm going off at the house, later adding the detail about forgetting his laptop. When he described the beginning of the attack, he first said that he had gone inside and heard a noise upstairs, only to later claim that he had been attacked almost immediately after entering his house. Even the way he described going down into the basement during the assault changed. In one telling, he was pushed down the stairs by the intruder. In another, he fell down the stairs. Finally, he said that he was pretty sure he had tripped. Those were just a few examples, though. In fact, just as a side note, we came across so many slightly different versions of what Richard said happened during the alleged home invasion that it was difficult to even know what to include in the initial retelling of events. The final glaring inconsistency, however, The one that would come to define the case was a piece of evidence that no one saw coming: Connie's Fitbit. When police took a look at data from the exercise tracker, it initially lined up with what Richard had said. Connie had gotten up, done some things around the house, and then headed to the YMCA, where she was recorded by the building's surveillance cameras. She had found out that her class was canceled, then returned home at about 9:20 a.m. However, this is where everything diverged. Rather than finding herself in the middle of a terrifying assault and almost immediately being shot and killed, tracking from the Fitbit showed that instead, Connie had walked around her house for a bit until about 9:37 a.m., when she posted a video to Facebook. When authorities looked into the Facebook activity, IP tracing showed that Connie had indeed made the post from inside the house. After that, she had spent another 20 or so minutes walking around and doing things in the house. The Fitbit's last bit of tracked activity didn't stop until after 10 a.m. Not only did this mean that Connie was alive well after Richard had claimed, the Fitbit's pulse monitor never showed any evidence of an elevated heart rate during the entire time that Connie was in the house. It seemed that however long she'd been inside, she hadn't been running or in a panicked state prior to her death. Finally, during the time that Connie was home before her murder, her Fitbit showed that she had walked more than 1,200 feet. This was nearly 10 times the distance that she would have had to walk if she had simply come into the house and run into the basement during the attack, as Richard had described. Though the case was delayed by many things following Richard's arrest, including the pandemic, it finally went to trial in the spring of 2022, ending with him being convicted of all charges. In August of that same year, he was sentenced to 65 years in prison. On the morning of October 9th, 2000, residents of Lefroy, Australia, awoke to some unexpectedly terrifying and tragic news. One of their neighbors had been found dead outside of his home, and all signs pointed to the case being a brutal murder. The victim was 72-year-old David Crawford, a retired veteran of the Royal Australian Navy, and a man who was well known and well liked by those in town. David had a reputation for being a kind and generous neighbor, one who could always be relied upon to lend a hand with odd jobs and errands, and who also looked out for other elderly residents, doing things like driving them to doctor's appointments. For the most part, David had lived a quiet life, with his greatest joy being the time he spent with his grandchildren. Needless to say, he didn't have any known enemies, nor could those that knew him think of any reason someone might have wanted him dead. The lack of any discernible conflict in David's life was only part of what made his murder so troubling, however. You see, Lefroy is a tiny former mining town located near the northern coast of the Australian island of Tasmania. While the island itself only has a population of about 570,000, Lefroy is small even by Tasmanian standards and is home to just a few dozen people. The most up-to-date numbers we were able to find estimate that about 76 people currently live in Lefroy, and it's a safe bet that there were probably even fewer residents back in 2000. All of this is to say that violent crime was not something that the people of Lefroy were used to. What was worse, given how few people passed through the town, it meant that the culprit was likely one of their own. The biggest surprise was yet to come, however. It turned out that there was a silent witness to David's brutal murder, one that would ultimately provide police with the information they needed to put his killer behind bars. The investigation into David Crawford's murder officially began at around 7:30 that morning, when police received a call from a pair of cousins who had stumbled across his body while out walking their dog. The 72-year-old was found lying unresponsive on the grass outside his house. He was wearing pajamas and had obvious wounds to his face and head, which police theorized were the result of being struck repeatedly with some kind of unknown heavy object. However, that object was not able to be recovered at the scene. A search of David's home revealed that his wallet, which those that knew him said was always in his bedroom, was missing. This indicated to police that robbery was a possible motive, especially since many elderly residents of the town were known to keep sizable amounts of cash in their homes. Despite this seemingly promising clue, however, none of the rest of the house bore any of the hallmarks of a typical burglary. There were no signs of a struggle or forced entry, and no fingerprints belonging to anyone other than David were found inside. A burglary also didn't seem to explain why David's body had been found outside of his house. Fortunately for detectives, it wasn't long before they got their first lucky break in the case. After noticing some blood on the grass close to where David's body had been found, they decided to test the area with luminol. For those that have never seen an episode of Forensic Files before, luminol is a chemical that is usually used by forensic investigators to test for the presence of blood. Luminol reacts with the iron in hemoglobin, initiating a chemical reaction that causes the solution to glow. In this case, authorities waited until night to fall so that the results of the test would be easier to observe. When they sprayed the luminol, they couldn't believe what they were seeing. It revealed an area in the grass that perfectly resembled the head and part of the handle of an axe. Police were confident that they had now identified their murder weapon. Further DNA tests proved that the blood detectives had recovered belonged to David Crawford. When an autopsy was conducted on David's remains the following day, forensic pathologist Dr. Robert Kelsall agreed with the investigators' theory that the murder weapon had been an axe. He also confirmed that these blows to the face and head had been what had killed David, and he was able to narrow down a possible time of death to between 4 and 7:30 a.m. on the morning he was found. With this evidence now in hand, police turned to residents in the area in the hopes that they might have witnessed something suspicious within the time frame that David had been murdered. Unfortunately, aside from a few people who said that they had heard some neighborhood dogs barking that morning, no one had seen anything. The one exception was a 19-year-old local man named Ivan Jones. While Ivan told police that he also hadn't seen anything on the actual morning of the murder, he claimed that a few nights prior he had observed a man with a flashlight who appeared to be poking around outside of David's house during the middle of the night. Ivan said that he had even warned David about what he had seen, but that he didn't think the elderly man had taken it very seriously. He stated that he didn't recognize the unknown man, though, and had no idea who it might have been. While Ivan's account could have been seen as yet another loose end in the investigation, something about the story didn't sit right with detectives. Instead, after hearing him out, detectives asked Ivan where he had been at the time of David's murder. You see, Ivan and his cousin Darcy McLean had actually been the ones that had found David's body in the first place and alerted police. This, in and of itself, wasn't all that suspicious. But now it seemed that Ivan was further inserting himself into the investigation by claiming to be the only person to witness anything strange at David's house in the lead up to his murder. It all seemed a bit too convenient to detectives. With that, they started taking a closer look at Ivan Jones and Darcy McLean. Ivan claimed that between the hours of 1 and 6 a.m. on the morning of the murder, he had been at his sister's house where he had slept for the night. This was corroborated by Ivan's sister, who said that he was there that morning and that as far as she knew, he had never left. Darcy's alibi was far less concrete. Though he also claimed to be at home and asleep during the time when David was killed, he lived alone, so there was no one to back up what he was saying. Despite this, Darcy was able to give police a couple of very useful pieces of information. First, he claimed that an axe of the same type that police believed was the murder weapon had gone missing from his home. Second, he claimed that Ivan had been acting strangely on the morning that they had discovered David's body. According to Darcy, shortly before they had gone out to walk the dog that morning, Ivan had shown up at his house and asked for a ride to his parents' place. Apparently, Ivan had never made a request like this before, and it was unlike him to show up at his house like that so early. Darcy said that his cousin also appeared to be nervous. Though these statements put the focus of the investigation firmly on Ivan Jones, authorities knew that the small amount of evidence they had so far would be insufficient to prove any kind of case against him. In particular, detectives were going to have to find a way to poke holes in his alibi. That's when a discovery was made that blew the case wide open. When David Crawford's body was initially taken in for examination, Dr. Kelsall spent most of his time looking at the wounds to his head and face and carefully examining any details that were apparent without removing the pajamas he had been found in. This was apparently procedure and was done to preserve as much evidence that might be on the exterior of the body as possible in the hopes that it might aid in the investigation. However, when David's clothing was finally removed, Dr. Kelsall noticed something that no one on the investigative team had known about prior. The 72-year-old victim had a pacemaker, which had been implanted in his chest due to a heart condition just a few months before his death. Though Dr. Kelsall wasn't an expert on the medical device, the discovery gave him an idea. He had heard that some pacemakers kept a digital record of heart activity so that doctors could check to make sure everything was working and look for signs of trouble. If this was true, then Dr. Kelsall might be able to use the pacemaker to prove David's exact time of death. Just a minor side note here. Contrary to how it's portrayed in a lot of crime TV shows and movies, determining an accurate time of death is actually an extremely difficult thing to do. There are a huge amount of factors that can affect how a body starts to break down after death. And in many cases, the most concrete predictions that can be made only narrow this window to a span of at least a few hours. As previously mentioned, initially Dr. Kelsall had been able to conclude that David had likely died between 4 and 7:30 a.m. on the morning of the murder. However, this was nothing compared to what David's pacemaker could potentially tell him. All of that being said, after the forensic pathologist came to this realization, he knew that time would not be on his side. David had been found nearly 30 hours ago by this point, and while his pacemaker would have likely been unaffected by the actual attack, the small device had a limited amount of memory it could store before being overwritten. Most similar devices at the time reportedly had a memory of under 2 days, meaning that if investigators didn't get the information they needed off the pacemaker soon, the crucial window of time that they needed to look at would be lost forever. In an amazing stroke of luck, Dr. Kelsall was able to get a cardiology technician to come almost immediately, and they were able to get to the data they needed in time. The forensic pathologist would later state that it was close. If they had waited even a couple of hours longer, the information investigators needed would have been overwritten in the pacemaker's memory. And yet another lucky break. It turned out that David's pacemaker had also been a relatively modern model for the time. An onboard computer chip in the device was designed to log what were referred to as event memories. Basically, points of note in heart activity to make it easier for doctors to find areas of interest. This allowed authorities to create a detailed graph with the pacemaker software, allowing them to retrace David's final moments. Based on the data, investigators were able to see that David had gone to bed just after 10 p.m. on October 8th. He'd remained asleep until 4:46 a.m. when he woke up, and the pacemaker showed that he had engaged in some level of activity. Authorities speculated that this might have been when he went outside. At 4:54 a.m., his heart rate spiked dramatically, indicating that this was likely when he had been attacked. By 5:04 a.m., the confrontation had ended, and David's vital signs were beginning to slow. That data showed that he had laid dying until 5:34 a.m., when his heart gave its last beat. With their timeline of the case significantly narrowed, investigators now began to take a second look at all of the evidence they had collected in the case. This time, the pieces started to fall into place. The first bit of the puzzle to come together had to do with why David had gone outside on the morning of the murder, and why his house hadn't looked like the typical scene of a burglary. This, detectives theorized, was because David had never actually been the intended target. While questioning residents in the area, police had learned that David had been looking after the home of an elderly neighbor while he was in the hospital. Because Lefroy was such a small town, everyone would have known that this neighbor's house was empty, making it the prime target for a break-in. Investigators speculated that on the morning of the murder, this is precisely what had happened. The suspect had tried to break into the neighbor's house to commit a burglary. However, when he did so, he had been barked at by neighborhood dogs, the same ones that multiple people in the area reported hearing that morning. The noises had awoken David, who had gone over to his neighbor's house to investigate. David had caught the suspect in the act, who had chased him back to his property and attacked him. The killer had then opportunistically stolen from David's house, which would have been unlocked from him coming outside to investigate. The next piece of the puzzle to come together concerned Ivan Jones's alibi. Though his sister had initially said that she believed that he had been at her house with her and her boyfriend that morning, she later changed her timeline. She now claimed that she had talked to Ivan shortly before she went to bed at 3 a.m. when he asked her for a cigarette. She hadn't seen him again until 6 that morning, when she awoke to the sounds of Ivan in the shower. This not only meant that Ivan no longer had an alibi specifically for the period of time covering the murder, but detectives also viewed it as suspicious that the 19-year-old was in the shower immediately afterwards. Their suspicions only deepened when they discovered that at the same time, Ivan had washed all of the clothes he had been wearing that morning, making sure to use bleach. Investigators speculated that this had been his attempt to destroy any potential evidence left behind on his body and clothes from the murder. While authorities were unable to find the axe that had been used as the murder weapon, they were now certain that it was the same one that had been taken from Darcy McLean's home. They theorized that Ivan had stolen the tool, intending to use it to help him break into David's neighbor's house on the morning of the murder. Instead, he had been caught by David, and in a panic had killed him before going into his house and stealing his wallet. Authorities searched for the axe and the wallet extensively, but unfortunately, they weren't able to recover either of them. This was not all that surprising, though, as given that Lefroy was a former mining town, it was littered with numerous abandoned water-filled mine shafts where it would have been all too easy to dispose of this kind of evidence where it would never be found. What investigators did find, however, was nearly just as good. While searching Ivan's home, they discovered a large metal flashlight, which had been concealed in a small sort of crawl space area of the foundation, accessible from the exterior of the house. It was obvious that the flashlight hadn't been there very long, as despite being more or less exposed to the elements, the item was fairly clean and wasn't covered in any kind of dirt or dust. In fact, it looked as though it might have been recently wiped down. Though they weren't able to recover any fingerprints from the flashlight, when investigators did a thorough swab of the item, paying special attention to the area in and around the on-off button, they were able to extract a single DNA profile. It belonged to David Crawford. Authorities therefore theorized that after being woken up on the morning of the murder, David had grabbed a flashlight to see what was going on. After beating David to death, Ivan had stolen the flashlight, though had not disposed of it the same way that he had the wallet and the axe. None of the sources we came across provided any sort of insight as to why Ivan might have kept the flashlight. Though, if you ask us, it's possible that since it was still dark outside at the time of the murder, Ivan might have kept the item to use as a light source when he dumped the other items. This likely would have come in handy, especially if Ivan did as police suspected and got rid of the items in an abandoned mine shaft. The light source would have both allowed him to make sure that the items were well hidden and stopped Ivan from accidentally stumbling into one of the mine shafts himself. However, this is pure speculation on our part. After all of this was taken care of, police theorized that Ivan had gone back to his sister's place, made sure that she heard him in the shower as part of his alibi, and then had gone over to his cousin Darcy's house, evidently believing it would be less suspicious if he made it look like he was the one who had stumbled across David's body and alerted police. The irony of this, of course, was that this move was what ultimately made Ivan look suspicious in the first place, and his rush to have the body discovered was what gave investigators enough time to recover the data from David's pacemaker. If he had waited even a couple of hours, detectives might never have been able to find the valuable information on the device that they needed, and they might not have been able to poke holes in Ivan's alibi. Instead, David's pacemaker ended up being the key to the entire investigation, and when the case subsequently went to court, apparently marked the first time that data from such a device was used in a murder trial. In October of 2001, Ivan Jones was convicted of murder and sentenced to 20 years in prison. Despite the senseless and violent nature of his crime, according to reports, Ivan was given parole almost immediately after becoming eligible in March of 2011, upon serving his mandatory 10-year non-parole period. Even so, it appears that Ivan has been in and out of jail ever since, mostly due to drug-related parole violations. His parole was first suspended in October of 2014 when he failed the drug test, but this was only for a brief time, and he was let out for a second time. This happened again in 2016, 2017, 2018, 2020, and 2021, though it's worth pointing out that none of these breaches were for violent offenses. The most current information we were able to find about Ivan states that he was last paroled in December of 2021. In early October of 1991, 32-year-old Dawn Elaine Sanchez was reported missing. Family members told police that while it wasn't unusual for Dawn to go a few days without calling, it had now been several weeks, and they were growing increasingly concerned. This was especially strange because the last time they had spoken to her, she said that she was planning an upcoming trip home to Montana. Police started by checking Dawn's last known address, a motel in the city of Los Altos, California, called the Four Seasons Motor Lodge. There, they learned that she also hadn't been seen in some time. In fact, the last time anyone could say that she had been there for sure was the end of August. Based on further interviews with those that knew her, police were able to put together a crude, if somewhat contradictory picture of Dawn's life prior to her disappearance. Dawn was a known drug user, and at one point had been involved in sex work, though most people seemed unsure if this was still the case. They knew that she had worked at a brothel in Nevada, but she had since left to move to California. Others said that she had been trying to move away from her formerly risky lifestyle at the time she went missing, and had been looking for some stability. The one thing most people did agree on, though, was who might be able to help police better answer their questions. A 30-year-old man named Bernardo Bass. Not only was Bernardo supposedly involved in a romantic relationship with Dawn, he was with her when she had last been seen in late August. The pair were spotted leaving the Four Seasons Motor Lodge together in Bernardo's tan and brown 1979 Pontiac Grand Prix. When police spoke to Bernardo, he immediately tried to minimize the nature of his relationship with Dawn. He said that she was still involved in sex work and that he was merely one of her clients, nothing more. But by this time, police knew that he was lying. They had found love letters that Bernardo had written to Dawn, ones in which he had discussed wanting to marry her and have children. Needless to say, this raised the suspicions of investigators, especially when those that knew Dawn started to tell other stories about Bernardo. According to them, their relationship had been pretty troubled. Bernardo was angry, jealous, and controlling, to the point where Dawn had sometimes been afraid to be alone with him. In one instance, they claimed that he had even broken into her apartment to secretly look through her address book. Following this, he had apparently slashed the car tires of several men who he believed were interested in her. Things took an even more disturbing turn, though, when police were approached by a man who claimed to have information about the case. The man, who referred to himself as Chopsticks, but whose real name was William Alcorn, told police that he believed he had been a witness to Dawn's disappearance. William explained that on or around the night of August 30th, he had met up with Dawn and Bernardo after they left the Four Seasons Motor Lodge. He said that the three of them had traveled in Bernardo's tan Pontiac to a large vacant lot near the Twin Creeks Sports Complex in the city of Sunnyvale. William wouldn't say why they had traveled there, but police speculated that it was either to buy or consume drugs. He did reiterate, though, that he thought he had been brought along because Dawn didn't want to be with Bernardo by herself. After hanging around for some time outside of the car, William claimed that Bernardo and Dawn had gotten back in together. He said that they drove about 100 yards away from where they had all previously been standing and then stopped the car once again. Soon after, he could hear what sounded like the pair of them fighting. Then, out of nowhere, William said he heard a gunshot coming from inside, after which the vehicle sped out of the vacant lot and took off. With this information, police felt that they had enough to move forward with the case against Bernardo, and he was arrested and charged with Dawn's murder. However, it wasn't long before things began to fall apart. For starters, and perhaps most importantly, authorities didn't have a body. They'd searched everywhere they could think of for Dawn, and information had been circulated about what she was wearing, along with identifying features like tattoos, but no one came forward. Initially, investigators thought that they could compensate for this by finding Bernardo's Pontiac. After all, they reasoned, if Bernardo had shot Dawn inside the vehicle, there should be plenty of forensic evidence proving that a violent crime had occurred. However, they quickly hit a dead end with the car as well. When detectives spoke to Bernardo's sister, she told them that she had sold the Pontiac at her brother's request and that it was now lost. Then, authorities received a final and decisive gut punch. Their only witness, William Alcorn, said he refused to testify against Bernardo in court. Not only that, but somehow police had lost the taped interview they had conducted with him where he had initially shared all of the details, so they didn't even have the option of using that instead. With no body, no vehicle, no murder weapon, and no witness, investigators were left with no other choice but to drop the charges against Bernardo in 1992 and let him go free. With that, the investigation was suspended and the case went cold. For well over a decade, Dawn Sanchez's case remained more or less forgotten. That was until October of 2006, when the investigation was quietly reopened almost 15 years to the day that it had first began. Well, it's not exactly clear what prompted this development. Multiple sources we came across in our research suggested that it started when police were approached by a second witness. This witness claimed that Bernardo Bass had done concrete work at his residence just a few days after Dawn's disappearance. As luck would have it, Bernardo still lived in the same place that he had back in 1991. It was a small, converted garage, about 500 square feet in total area, that sat in the rear yard of two adjacent houses in Santa Clara that were owned by his parents. In April of 2007, investigators acquired permission to search the residence, and what they found both disturbed and frustrated them. Inside Bernardo's bedroom closet, detectives found an area that looked like it had been assembled at a different time than the rest of the structure. It turned out that it was covering a hidden area about 20 inches wide and 4 feet deep, which sources interchangeably describe as a sort of niche or nook. Though there was nothing in there now, multiple cadaver dogs alerted police to the scent of human remains. Detectives were sure that this is where Bernardo had hidden Dawn's body for some time after murdering her, before eventually moving her. In fact, a family member told detectives that roughly 2 years earlier, Bernardo had made a comment saying that he needed to seal off the compartment, quote, in case the police ever search here. Not long after this discovery, authorities decided to charge Bernardo with Dawn's murder for a second time. By this point, the then 46-year-old had racked up quite the criminal history. He had several convictions for things like domestic violence and firearms violations, and at the time was in prison for violating probation after an assault conviction for hitting his brother over the head with a hammer. A police report attached to his public court file referred to him as, quote, a serious danger to society. Despite all of this, when news that Dawn's case was being reopened first broke, it seemed like detectives might be repeating the mistakes of their initial investigation. They were still trying to keep things under wraps from the public, but it soon became clear, thanks to local reporting, that they were once again searching for Dawn's remains and were coming up empty-handed. That summer, the Calabasas Creek was searched extensively, and divers were sent into other waterways around Bernardo's home and the area where William claimed that the three of them had been hanging out when he witnessed the murder. Eventually, though, police admitted that they had not found anything. Fortunately for detectives, they would win a minor victory in the fall of that year when Bernardo and his lawyer tried to have the charges dismissed against him for the second time. They argued that there was insufficient evidence, specifically pointing to the fact that police had lost the videotape of their interview with William. However, the judge denied this motion. It turned out that detectives still did have detailed notes and a written transcript of their interview with William, and the judge ruled that this was good enough. Despite this playing out in their favor, detectives now knew that they would need more if they wanted to finally secure a conviction against Bernardo. The transcript of William Alcorn's interview would be useful to them at trial, but they knew they still had no shot at getting him to testify. When they caught up with William again in 2008 and asked him if he would reconsider telling his story, he invoked his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination and once again refused to testify against Bernardo. However, all was not yet lost. While William wasn't willing to cooperate with police, there was someone else who was willing to reconsider. During another interview, Bernardo's sister, who had originally told police that she had sold his Pontiac after Dawn's disappearance, now admitted that she had lied. She said that she had never done anything with the car, and that she had fabricated her statement out of fear of her brother, who had told her what to say. The reason this was important was because it went hand in hand with another statement that police had received from an informant who said that Bernardo had disassembled his Pontiac after the murder. He had supposedly buried the parts in a large abandoned lot in San Jose's Alviso neighborhood. As a side note here, it's not exactly clear if this is the same lot where William claimed that the murder had taken place. Sources don't appear to mention either way, but it seems reasonable to speculate that this is the case, since, if you'll recall, William said that the lot they were in was near the Twin Creeks Sports Complex. While the complex itself is in Sunnyvale, it's right on the northeastern edge by San Francisco Bay, and Alviso is directly to the east. We can't say for certain, but we just wanted to mention that for the sake of full disclosure. Anyway, though detectives now had their best lead yet on the whereabouts of Bernardo's Pontiac, after actually arriving at the vacant lot, they quickly realized that they had their work cut out for them. The lot was so large that excavating the whole site was immediately off the table, as it would have been wildly expensive. Metal detectors were also useless because the area was completely scattered with debris that would have made finding anything next to impossible. It was at this point that a new group of people stepped in to give detectives a hand. This group was a crack team of scientists and engineers from NASA, the United States Geological Survey, and Carnegie Mellon University's Innovation Lab. It just so happened that the three organizations were collaborating on a project at the time that they thought might be just what authorities needed. That project was the Sensetta Max 5.0A rover, a small ground vehicle equipped with magnetic surveying technology and ground-penetrating radar that had been designed to conduct intelligent autonomous Earth science missions. The rover was deployed in the Alviso lot, and using its tools was able to collect a wealth of data from under the ground. This information was analyzed by the algorithms and platforms that NASA and Carnegie Mellon had created for the project, then handed over to the United States Geological Survey for further data interpretation and processing. Finally, the USGS was able to go back to investigators and tell them where the best places were to dig. Sure enough, when these sites were excavated, they recovered pieces of Bernardo's Pontiac Grand Prix. They had been in the ground at this point for 18 years. Well, this was a huge win for authorities, not to mention an unprecedentedly creative way to solve a murder. They decided that taking the case to court was still risky, considering everything that had happened up until that point. They offered Bernardo a plea deal, which he eventually accepted. In August of 2009, a month before the trial was due to start, Bernardo pleaded no contest to involuntary manslaughter and was sentenced to 6 years in prison. However, he was also given credit for the time that he had served up until that point, both during the initial investigation and when the charges were filed again in 2007. This meant that he only had to serve a little over 2 years in prison at the time of his sentence. Understandably, this is one of those cases that still feels very incomplete. Not just because you could certainly argue that justice wasn't really done, but also because what happened to Dawn Sanchez still very much remains a mystery. To this day, her remains have never been found, meaning that after all these years, her friends and family have still been left to wonder. That being said, we would argue that there is a silver lining here, however thin. If nothing else, this story is also a reminder that even in the seemingly most dead-end investigations, there was always something left to try. You never know what clue might make all the difference, or what innovative new idea or technique might lead to a breakthrough. In other words, there was always hope. When it comes to forensic science, we all know that DNA has long been the gold standard in terms of securing criminal convictions and solving crimes. In the overwhelming majority of cases, we're used to seeing this DNA coming directly from perpetrators or victims. However, as this last case reminds us, sometimes investigators are forced to get a little creative. In May of 1992, a motorcyclist stumbled across a horrifying scene in a deserted area of Maricopa County, Arizona, somewhere on the outskirts of the city of Phoenix. It was the partially clothed, lifeless body of a woman. She had been beaten and strangled to death, and her ankles had been loosely bound with shoelaces and what appeared to be some sort of wire. When police arrived at the scene, they noticed a t-shirt around the woman's neck. They theorized that this was what had been used to strangle her, and given the woman's state of undress, they also suspected that the crime might have been sexually motivated. When an autopsy was performed on the woman's body, a fingerprint search revealed a match. The victim was identified as 30-year-old Denise Johnson, a single mother of 2 children. Denise had had a tough life, and as a young woman, things had only gotten more difficult for her when she got into drugs. In turn, she made her living mostly by selling drugs at truck stops in the Phoenix area, and was somewhat notorious for shortchanging truck drivers during these deals. It was easy to see how Denise could have gotten herself into trouble if she ripped off the wrong person. Luckily for investigators, it didn't take long for them to find their first major lead in the case. While analyzing the crime scene, they heard sounds of an electronic device beeping. It turned out to be a pager that belonged to a 34-year-old local truck driver named Mark Bogan. He lived less than a 20-minute drive away from the place where Denise's body had been found. When questioned about his activities leading up to the murder, Mark fully admitted that he had been with Denise the previous night. He said that she had approached him while he had stopped to use a payphone at a truck stop on the way home from work, and had asked him for a ride to the interstate. The two had hopped into Mark's pickup truck after the call and had left shortly thereafter. Mark stated that along the way, Denise had made advances towards him, so he had pulled over along the side of the road so that they could get intimate. He claimed that at some point, though, he realized that this had merely been a ruse to steal from him, and the two of them had gotten into a fight over his wallet before he kicked Denise out of the vehicle. He said that he didn't initially notice that his pager was missing, but that Denise must have taken it during that same struggle, and that's how it had been found with her body. Mark claimed that he was innocent of the murder, and moreover, that he had never been to the area where Denise's body was found. Police didn't buy Mark's story, and in particular were suspicious of a small scratch mark to his face that they noticed while questioning him. They thought that this injury could have been from Denise scratching him during a struggle before her murder, and decided to test under her fingernails for blood or skin samples. Much to the surprise of investigators, though, no such evidence was found during Denise's autopsy. What's more, it seemed that there was no other physical evidence present at the crime scene or on Denise's body that linked Mark to the crime. It seemed like the case was in serious trouble until police stumbled across a chance discovery. While analyzing the crime scene, one of the homicide detectives assigned to the case noticed a mark on a Palo Verde tree very close to where Denise's body was found. For those unfamiliar, Palo Verde trees are some of the most drought-tolerant trees in the world, and they thrive in the southwestern United States and Mexico. So much so that the Palo Verde is the state tree of Arizona. Because the mark to this specific Palo Verde tree appeared fresh, and the tree was in such close proximity to the crime scene, police theorized that it was probably related to their investigation. Detectives photographed the mark on the tree and plucked a couple of bean pods off of it to keep as evidence. Around the same time that this was happening, investigators conducted a search of Mark Bogan's pickup truck. Like during Denise's autopsy, no physical evidence of great significance was found inside. However, detectives did make one noteworthy discovery in the bed of the truck. It was a couple of bean pods that also appeared to have come from a Palo Verde tree. This caused investigators to theorize that the mark left on the Palo Verde tree at the crime scene had been made by Mark's truck, and that the bean pods had fallen into the bed of his truck when he had hit it. The only question now was whether they could prove it. In order to do so, they would need to try and prove that the bean pods had come from this exact tree. While plants, like all living things, have DNA, this kind of comparison had never been done in forensics before. Police reached out to countless experts with their task until they finally found a plant geneticist at the University of Arizona who agreed to try and help them out. Dr. Timothy Helent-Yaris. Dr. Helent-Yaris said that he would try using a technique called the randomly amplified polymorphic DNA, or RAPD, to compare the bean pods found in Mark's truck to the tree at the crime scene. According to sources we came across, RAPD is different than the restriction fragment length polymorphism, or RFLP testing, that was normally used to analyze and compare human DNA samples at the time. Though not used in forensics up until that point, RAPD was common in lab research and was especially useful for looking at genetic variation in organisms whose genomes had not been thoroughly mapped or sequenced, as was the case with the Palo Verde tree. While Dr. Helent-Yaris had now provided a way to potentially compare the two bean pod samples, investigators knew that because the technique was unprecedented at a criminal trial, it wouldn't be enough to simply show that the two bean pods were a match. They would also have to show that there was significant variation between the DNA of Palo Verde trees themselves. Basically, that they were unique enough that you couldn't simply match a bean pod to any random tree. In order to do this, investigators collected samples from 100 different Palo Verde trees and gave them to Dr. Helent-Yaris to test against the sample taken from Mark's truck. Without telling him, they also slipped in one of the samples they had taken from the tree at the crime scene as well. When he conducted the tests, Dr. Helent-Yaris not only found that each of the 100 Palo Verde trees had a distinct DNA profile, he also found that one of the samples was an exact match to the bean pods taken from Mark's truck. Dr. Helent-Yaris apparently thought he had made a mistake, until investigators informed him that they had actually snuck in that other sample. The results made police confident that the case was now ready for trial. Mark Bogan had definitely been at the scene of the crime. He was arrested and charged with Denise's murder. At Mark's trial, the prosecution relied heavily on the plant DNA evidence, as much of the rest of the case was circumstantial. The defense initially tried to get the plant DNA excluded as evidence from the proceedings altogether. However, when that failed, they switched to arguing that the evidence was planted. No pun intended, of course. This also failed, and in May of 1993, Mark Bogan was the first person in the United States, and possibly the world, to be convicted based on plant DNA evidence. He was sentenced to life in prison, and subsequent attempts to overturn the verdict were unsuccessful. In the years since Mark's conviction, numerous other cases have also relied on plant DNA evidence, though it still seems to be a relatively unknown technique as far as popular culture is concerned. Hey there. Before you take off, we'd just like to take a second and say that we really appreciate you sticking around to the end of the video. Luke and I are so grateful for our incredible Crime Zone community, so thank you for being a part of it. If you want to help Crime Zone continue to grow, one of the easiest things you can do is leave a like on this video and consider subscribing. Be sure to hit that notification bell as well and select all notifications to stay up to date with our latest releases. If you're looking for additional ways to support the channel, there are a couple of options. We've got a thriving community over on Patreon, where you can get ad-free and early access to all of our content, as well as 4 additional stories per week for each of our Crimes of the Week and Crimes of the Week International videos. Head over to patreon.com/crimezone to learn more and to meet some of the awesome people whose names are currently on screen. If that isn't your thing, we've also now launched channel memberships so you can join directly here on YouTube. Channel members get a lot of the same perks as on Patreon, including extra content, without the added hassle of having to go off-platform. Now, that being said, we know times are tough and that not everyone is able to support financially. Regardless of your situation though, we want you to know that we truly appreciate every like, sub, share, and comment that you send our way. Once again, thanks so much, and we hope to see you soon.